At 67 years old, and after 4 decades working as a seamstress out of my house in Southside Atlanta, I never imagined I'd hear my daughter-in-law, Tasha, celebrate my absence from my son Ethan's wedding, as if my presence were some kind of curse she had finally managed to dodge. That Saturday morning I woke up before sunrise, just as I had done every day since my husband, Curtis, passed away 15 years ago. I carefully pressed my best navy blue dress, the one I had bought specifically for this occasion after saving up for 3 months. This was the wedding of Ethan, my only child, the boy I raised alone after Curtis died in a work accident when we were barely 35. I fixed my hair with extra care, put on my mother's pearl earrings, and checked the gift I had prepared for what felt like the 5th time. It was a complete set of hand-embroidered sheets that had taken me 2 months to finish, working every night after completing my daily sewing orders. The trouble started when I left my house headed for the First Metropolitan Baptist Church downtown. The main water pipe on Clover Lane had burst overnight, completely flooding the main avenue. Firefighters had blocked off 3 city blocks, forcing all traffic onto back streets I had never navigated before. My neighbor Layla yelled from her window, "Grace, you can't get out this way. It's all shut down since 5 in the morning." I had to walk 15 blocks in my high heels until I found a taxi willing to take the long route around the city periphery. By the time I finally arrived at First Metropolitan, the ceremony was already over. I looked for the main entrance to the reception hall, which was clearly marked by arches, but I got confused in the parking lot and ended up walking toward the back of the venue, where there was a small garden with benches for the bridesmaids to rest on between photos. That's when I heard the unmistakable voice of Tasha, my daughter-in-law, talking to her friends Kendra and Candace. Thank goodness she missed the whole ceremony. You know how she is, always with her sad stories, always talking about how hard it was raising Ethan alone, always reminding everyone she doesn't have any money. It's way better that she only showed up now. Kendra laughed and added, "Oh, mothers-in-law are all the same, always playing the victim. My mom says it's typical of those older ladies who have absolutely nothing else to do but stick their noses in their kids' lives." Candace finished the thought. Plus, can you even imagine if she had shown up in that old outfit? You can totally tell she doesn't know how to dress for elegant occasions. It's definitely better this way, right? No poor mother-in-law drama. The 3 of them laughed while I stood frozen behind a bougainvillea tree, feeling their words pierce my chest like a jolt of cold electricity. Old outfit? This dress had cost me the equivalent of a week's pay. Sad stories? I only told them about my life when they specifically asked, trying my best to be honest about my circumstances without sounding whiny. Poor mother-in-law drama? For 2 years I had financially helped Ethan and Tasha with the down payment for their condo, slowly giving them my savings every month until they finally had the $8,000 they needed. I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, checked my makeup in my purse mirror, and then walked into the ballroom through the main door with a calm smile on my face. "Grace, thank heavens you made it," Ethan shouted when he saw me, running to hug me. "Mom, I thought something terrible had happened to you." I hugged him tight, inhaling the comforting scent of his new cologne, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit against my cheek. "A pipe burst on my street, son. But I wasn't going to miss your wedding for anything in the world." Tasha approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mother Pyle, what a shame you missed the ceremony. It was so beautiful." I kissed her on the cheek and said, "The important thing is that you're married now. God bless you both." Throughout the entire reception, I began to notice familiar behaviors that I had previously ignored or rationalized in my mind. My sister-in-law Simone, Ethan's sister, introduced me to some people as Ethan's mom. But when other guests asked about my work or my life in general, she quickly changed the subject or subtly pulled her conversation partners away. My nephew Devin, Simone's son, barely greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek before disappearing among the younger guests. My nieces, Chloe and Skylar, who used to always seek me out to chat with at family gatherings, this time only exchanged courtesy greetings before finding convenient excuses to leave. When it was finally time to open the gifts, I watched every reaction extremely carefully. The expensive presents from Tasha's bridesmaids and relatives were met with genuine exclamations of joy and prolonged gratitude. When Ethan opened my package with the embroidered sheets, Tasha quickly lifted them, muttered an automatic, "Thanks, Mother Pyral," and immediately placed them beneath the table with the other less important gifts. The sheets on which I had invested at least 60 nights of labor, painstakingly embroidering intertwined initials and tiny flowers, were treated as an inconvenient formality to be swiftly dealt with and forgotten. It was at that exact moment, watching my heartfelt gift of love be discarded with such indifference, that the words I had overheard in the garden earlier gained a much deeper and more profound meaning. It wasn't just the cruel comment of a nervous daughter-in-law on her wedding day. It was a reflection of how they genuinely saw me, as someone inconvenient, outdated, and completely out of place in their prosperous modern lives. I was a relic from Ethan's past that they clearly preferred to keep on the sidelines of his new married life. During dinner, I sat at a table with people I didn't know very well, distant relatives of Tasha's, who were polite but also aloof. From my seat, I could see the main table where Ethan and Tasha were sitting, surrounded by their closest friends. They were all young professionals, dressed in expensive clothes, talking about topics I didn't fully grasp at all. Investments, international trips, exclusive restaurants. It was as if an invisible world completely separated us. A social barrier that I honestly didn't even know when it had been built. The dancing started with modern music that I didn't recognize at all. The younger guests immediately took over the dance floor, while the older ones remained chatting at the tables. I waited all night for Ethan to come and ask me to dance, as he always did at family parties, but he was completely absorbed in his new wife and his group of friends. At 11 o'clock at night, when the party was in full swing, I finally decided to go and say goodbye. "Son, I'm heading out now. I have to work early tomorrow." Ethan gave me a distracted hug. "Already leaving, Mom? Okay, have a good night. Thanks for coming." Tasha gave me an equally automatic farewell kiss. "Thanks for coming, Mother Parcel. See you soon." But in her eyes I saw something that ultimately confirmed what I had feared all night. Relief. She was relieved that I was leaving, that her perfect party could continue without the awkward presence of the humble mother-in-law, who just didn't fit into their new prosperous life as a couple. The cab ride home was completely silent. During the long 40-minute drive, I mentally reviewed every single detail of the night. The conversations where I was completely ignored, the moments where I was left talking all alone, the embarrassing introductions where Simone clearly minimized my importance, the obvious indifference toward my thoughtful gift, and Ethan's lack of interest in including me in any of his important conversations. For the very first time in my life, I began to seriously wonder if I had been living in a bubble of self-deception, believing that I was an important part of my son's life, when in reality I was merely a family obligation to be fulfilled occasionally. That night, back in my small Southside apartment, I sat in the rocking chair where I used to spend countless hours embroidering, and began to vividly remember all of the sacrifices I had made so that Ethan could get to where he was today. The years of working double shifts just to pay for his private school when the local public schools weren't good enough. The times I secretly sold my own things to buy him new clothes when he first started dating Tasha, who came from an upper-middle-class family. The Sundays I spent cooking for them when they were dating, preparing elaborate dishes that Tasha always photographed for her social media, but never actually learned to cook herself. I also vividly recalled the times Tasha had made seemingly innocent comments that now took on a completely different meaning and weight. "Mother Pyral, why don't you ever buy more modern clothes? Ethan has the money to help you." Or, "Doesn't it bother you that people know you're still working at your age? Ethan's a professional now." Or even the time she suggested that I cut my hair shorter because a woman your age looks so much better with short hair and less fuss. Comments that I had previously interpreted as well-intentioned advice, but now understood as attempts to control my appearance so that I wouldn't socially embarrass them. That morning, as I slowly took off the navy blue dress that I had chosen with such care, I saw myself reflected in the closet mirror. And for the first time in many, many years, I truly saw myself as others saw me. A 67-year-old woman with gray hair, deep wrinkles etched on her face, rough hands from so much sewing, and clothes that, though clean and well-kept, simply couldn't compete with the elegant standards of the social circle that Ethan now belonged to. I was a woman who represented the humble past that he clearly preferred to keep discreet in his new prosperous married life. It was there, standing in front of that mirror at 3 o'clock in the morning, when something fundamental finally broke inside my heart. Not in a dramatic or explosive way, but more like a silent crack that suddenly allowed me to see the undeniable truth that I had been consciously avoiding for months. My son no longer needed me as a present and actively participatory mother. He needed me as a distant, manageable memory, as a family obligation to be met occasionally, but definitely one that didn't interfere with his real life. The next day, Sunday morning, while having coffee in my small kitchen, I began to recall all of the obvious signs that I had ignored over the last year. Ethan's increasingly spaced-out visits, always in a hurry with Tasha waiting for him in the car, and the increasingly short phone calls where he seemed to be doing other things while talking to me. The family invitations that arrived later and later, as if they had debated for a long time about whether or not to even include me. I particularly remembered a phone conversation that I had accidentally overheard about 3 months earlier. Ethan had come to visit me and received a call from Tasha while he was in the bathroom. She didn't know that I was in the living room and spoke extremely loudly. "Are you done over there yet? Kendra invited us to lunch, and I don't want to be late just because we're visiting." When Ethan came out of the bathroom, I lied, saying that I had gone to the garden so as not to make him feel bad. But those words had been permanently engraved in my memory. Just because we're visiting. As if coming to see his own mother was somehow a chore to be completed as quickly as possible. Over the next 2 weeks, I decided to conduct a silent experiment. I completely stopped calling Ethan to see how long it would take him to contact me spontaneously. I stopped sending my usual good morning and good night texts. I stopped asking about Tasha or their weekend plans. I simply waited to see if my sudden communicative absence would even be noticed. The results were both revealing and incredibly painful. Ethan took a full 8 days to call me, and when he finally did, it was only to ask for a favor. He wanted me to embroider the initials on some brand new shirts that he had bought for work. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't even mention that I had been strangely silent. He didn't show any curiosity about my life or activities at all. He simply saw me as a useful resource that he could turn to when he needed something specific. I agreed to embroider the shirts, but while working on them in the evenings, I began planning some profound changes in how I related to the family going forward. Not dramatic changes or elaborate revenge, but just some silent adjustments in my expectations, and in the emotional energy that I invested in relationships that clearly weren't reciprocated with the same level of affection and respect. It was then that I started noticing so many other details that I had previously overlooked. During these long years of widowhood, I had always kept my house immaculate and my table always set for family visits that so rarely came. I had carefully saved money for generous gifts on birthdays and Christmas, but the gifts that I received in return were always cheap and thoughtless. I had hosted elaborate family dinners where I cooked for everyone, but I was never invited to similar events at their houses. The previous week had been particularly revealing. Tasha had posted photos on Facebook of a family dinner at her parents' house with Ethan smiling happily alongside all of his in-laws. I had not been invited or even mentioned at all. When I casually asked Ethan about the dinner, he said that it had been something improvised, very intimate, and that Tasha had just assumed that I wouldn't like the kind of food that they had prepared. Kind lies just to justify a deliberate exclusion. 3 weeks after the wedding, while embroidering napkins that no one had even asked for, but which I did out of pure habit, the phone suddenly rang. It was Tasha. "Mother Pearl, are you busy on Saturday? My mom really wants to get to know you better, and we thought we'd have a small family lunch." Her tone was that of someone fulfilling an uncomfortable social obligation. "What are we cooking?" I asked automatically, fully assuming that I would have to help with the preparation. "Oh no, don't worry about that at all. My mom has everything completely organized. Just come as a guest." On Saturday, I arrived at Tasha's parents' house in Buckhead with a dessert that I had specially prepared. A rich coconut custard pie that had taken me all morning to perfect. The house was beautiful, much larger than mine, with a sprawling lawn and elegant furniture that clearly evidenced a vastly superior financial position. Tasha's parents, Brenda and Marcus, greeted me with correct but cold courtesy throughout the entire meal. The conversation primarily revolved around topics that I didn't know very well at all. The trips that they had taken, the expensive restaurants that they had eaten at, and the investments that they were currently considering making. When I tried to participate by telling an anecdote from my work as a seamstress, or my experience raising Ethan alone, I noticed that the conversations abruptly stopped and were immediately redirected toward other topics. It was as if my life experiences just weren't interesting or relevant enough for that particular social environment. Tasha would translate my comments, as if they needed some sort of explanation or interpretation. My mother-in-law worked for many years sewing from home, or Grace went through very tough times when Ethan was little, always with a tone that sounded somewhere between compassionate and condescending. That afternoon, while I helped clear the dishes, even though they insisted that it wasn't necessary, I overheard Brenda comment softly to Tasha in the kitchen. "She's a very hard-working woman, but you can definitely tell that she comes from a very different background than ours. I really hope that Ethan finds a good balance between maintaining the family relationship and not compromising his new social status." Tasha responded, "Yes, it's definitely complicated, but Ethan understands that he has different responsibilities now." I returned home that night with a painful but liberating clarity. It wasn't just my imagination or my exaggerated sensitivity. There was a subtle, consistent campaign to minimize my presence in Ethan's new life. It wasn't malicious or consciously cruel, but just the natural evolution of a family that had ascended socially, and now saw the humble mother as an obstacle to their complete integration into a higher social circle. During the following days, I began to look at my own house with completely different eyes. The family photos filling the walls, the letters that Ethan had written me from college, thanking me for all of my sacrifices, and all of the memories of the happy times that we had shared when he depended completely on me. All of that now belonged to the past. The adult Ethan, married and professionally successful, no longer needed the mother who had struggled so hard to give him those opportunities. It was as if I had simply fulfilled my function in his life, and now it was time to discreetly retire to the background, appearing only when strictly necessary and always careful not to interfere with his new social image. The understanding of this reality didn't come with dramatic tears or cries of pain, but with a cold serenity that surprised even me. The definitive moment arrived exactly 1 month after the wedding. Ethan showed up at my house late on a Wednesday afternoon without Tasha, wearing a serious expression that I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "Mom, we really need to talk," he said, sitting on the armchair where he used to do all of his high school homework. "Tasha and I have been discussing our future, all of the plans that we have as a couple." I sat across from him with my hands folded in my lap, feeling that I was about to hear something that would forever change the relationship that we had carefully built over his 32 years of life. "We want to have kids soon," he continued, "and we want to be completely sure that we can offer them the best possible life. That means that we have to be very careful with our finances, our social connections, and the image that we project as a family." "I understand," I said, even though I didn't exactly understand where this conversation was actually heading. "Tasha thinks that it would be better if you were less frequent at our social gatherings, not because we don't love you, but because you come from a very different world than ours, and sometimes that can create awkward situations." His words were careful and rehearsed, as if he had practiced this particular conversation many times before coming. "Awkward situations?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, even though I felt like something was slowly crumbling inside my chest. "Well, your comments about money, about how hard it was raising me alone, and about your job. It's not wrong that you talk about it, but sometimes it makes people uncomfortable or makes them think things that we don't want them to think about our family." There was the naked truth that I had been avoiding for months. My honesty about my life, my struggles, and my financial limitations had somehow become a source of shame for my own son. The story of sacrifice and hard work that I had always considered my greatest pride was now an obstacle to the social image that he desperately wanted to project with his wife. "And what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, surprising myself with the calmness of my own voice. "That we see each other less often, and that when we have important family gatherings, especially with people from work or Tasha's parents, it would be better if you didn't come. We can still have lunch together occasionally, just the two of us, but the social stuff, it would probably be better to keep that completely separate." I remained silent for several long minutes, processing not just the words that I had heard, but the complete reality that they represented. My son, the boy that I had carried in my arms on so many nights of fever when I didn't have the money to take him to a private doctor, was now asking me to become invisible in his social life so as not to compromise his new middle to upper class identity. "That's fine," I finally said, and I saw the instant relief wash over his face. "I understand perfectly what you're telling me." He got up to hug me, likely expecting this to be the end of a difficult but necessary conversation. But as I felt his arms around me, something deeper than sadness was settling in my heart. It was a cold clarity, a silent determination that he couldn't possibly perceive. That night, after Ethan left with the clear conscience of having resolved the problem of his problematic mother, I sat down at my sewing table and began making plans. Not plans for revenge or family drama, but plans to completely reorganize my priorities and my emotional life. For 32 long years, I had lived primarily to be Ethan's mother. Now it was finally time to discover who Grace was when she wasn't defined solely by her maternal function. The 7 days that followed that conversation with Ethan were the most silent that I had lived in my Southside house since I became a widow. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for phone calls. I wasn't preparing extra food in case of visitors. I wasn't keeping the house immaculate for family visits. It was as if I had somehow entered a parallel dimension where I could finally hear my own thoughts without the constant worry about the needs of others. During those days, I began to systematically review every corner of my house, not to clean but to remember. Every single object had a story, and every photograph held a moment that I now saw with completely different eyes. In the living room cabinet, I found all of the letters that Ethan had written me from college, full of thanks and promises. "Mom, when I graduate, I'm going to buy you a bigger house. Thank you for all of the sacrifices that you've made for me. I'll never forget how hard you worked to pay for my degree." Every letter was a promise of a future where my effort would be recognized and rewarded. Now, reading them all again, I realized that Ethan had technically kept his promises. He had offered me occasional financial help. He had verbally thanked me for all of my sacrifices. And he had never publicly denied what I had done for him. But something much more subtle had been lost along the way. Genuine respect, natural inclusion, and a love that needs absolutely no explanation or justification. I had been gradually replaced by a much more convenient version of myself. A mother who existed only when necessary and disappeared whenever she might be problematic. The Wednesday of that week, while organizing the bills from the last few months, I found all of the receipts for the extra expenses that I had incurred during Ethan's courtship and engagement. Small amounts that individually didn't seem significant at all, but when added up represented almost 6 months of my full pension. The $50 that I lent them when Tasha wanted to upgrade the refrigerator before they even got married. The $100 that I spent on special ingredients to make the test cake that they wanted for the wedding. The $30 for the engagement gift that Tasha had specifically chosen. And the $20 worth of gas that I spent going to try on dresses with her because she needed an older woman's opinion. Every single expense had been presented as a temporary emergency or an investment in the couple's happiness, but it had never been reimbursed or even mentioned afterward. It wasn't even that I expected the money back, but it bothered me so much that I had been so incredibly naive not to realize that I was clearly being used as a convenient economic resource while simultaneously being excluded as an inconvenient social presence. On Thursday morning, my best friend Layla came to visit, as she had done every week for the past 20 years. Layla had been my confidant throughout all of the difficult years of widowhood, and she was honestly the only person who truly knew about all of my sacrifices and struggles to raise Ethan. She sat in the kitchen while I made coffee, and immediately noticed my different mood. "What's wrong, Grace? You seem very quiet." I told her everything: the wedding, Tasha's comments, the conversation with Ethan, and the request to be less socially visible. Layla listened without interrupting, but I saw a deep sadness in her eyes that confirmed that what was happening to me was not just my exaggerated imagination. "Look, honey," she said when I finally finished talking. "I've seen this happen before. In many families around here, the kids get educated, land good jobs, and marry women from better backgrounds. Then, bit by bit, they start to shed everything that reminds them of where they came from. It's not that they're bad people. It's just that they're embarrassed by their humble beginnings." Her words stung because they confirmed a fear I'd been trying to ignore. "But Ethan's not like that," I weakly protested. "He's never denied that we come from a working-class family." Layla reached across the table and took my hand. "No, honey," she said gently. "He doesn't deny it when he's alone with you. But when was the last time Tasha came to this house? When did Ethan last take you to meet his colleagues? When has he included you in his plans without you having to prompt him?" Layla's questions forced me to confront a reality I'd been dodging. Tasha had visited my house exactly 3 times in the 2 years they'd been dating, and those visits were always short and filled with excuses to leave quickly. Ethan had never invited me to any of his work functions, not even the holiday parties that included families. And whenever I suggested family outings, there was always a reason why it was better to wait for a more convenient time. "What would you do if you were me?" I asked Layla, feeling like I genuinely needed someone else's perspective for the first time. "I think you have to decide what you want for the rest of your life," she replied. "Do you want to continue being the mother who's always available when they need something but becomes invisible when it suits them? Or do you want to finally start living for yourself after 30 years of putting everyone else first?" That afternoon, after Layla left, I sank into my favorite rocking chair and started a mental exercise I'd never tried before. Imagining what my life would be like if I wasn't constantly worrying about Ethan and Tasha. What would I do with my evenings if I wasn't busy embroidering gifts that no one seemed to truly appreciate? How would I spend my money if I wasn't setting aside funds for family emergencies that always seemed to crop up? What kinds of plans would I make if I didn't have to keep my schedule open in case they needed something? For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream about my own aspirations. I'd always wanted to learn how to use a computer, so I could reconnect with old coworkers who had moved away. I'd wanted to take advanced embroidery classes to perfect techniques I'd only learned by observation. I'd wanted to travel to Charleston to visit my sister Maya, who had invited me countless times, but I always told her I couldn't leave the house alone in case Ethan needed me. On Friday night, as I ate dinner alone in front of the TV, the phone rang. It was Ethan. "Mom. How are you?" he asked. "I was just calling to say hello." His voice had that careful tone he used when he wanted to make sure I wasn't upset about something. "Fine, son. Just doing my thing," I replied, keeping my own voice neutral. "Have you thought about what we talked about the other day?" he asked. I could detect the anxiety hiding behind his casual question. He wanted confirmation that I had fully accepted his request to minimize my presence in his and Tasha's social life. "Yes, I've thought about it a lot," I said. "And I think you're right. It's better for everyone to have their own space." I heard the relief in his breathing. "I'm so glad you see it that way, Mom," he said. "I don't want you to think we don't love you. We just want everyone to be comfortable." After we hung up, I kept turning that word over in my mind, comfortable. It was interesting how their comfort seemed to require my discomfort, how their peace of mind depended on my silence. Over the weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I didn't make any plans with Ethan in mind. I didn't cook his favorite dishes in case he decided to visit. I didn't do any extra cleaning in case he and Tasha came over. I didn't put on nicer clothes in case they invited me out. I simply lived my weekend as if I were completely independent, and the feeling was strangely liberating. On Sunday morning, I went to Mass alone at St. Thomas Parish, where I'd been going for 20 years. But lately, I'd only gone when Ethan and Tasha didn't have other plans for me. After Mass, I stayed to chat with Beatrice, a woman my age who had recently become a widow. She always asked about Ethan with genuine interest. "So how's the young man doing? Has he adjusted to married life?" she asked as we walked towards the exit. For the first time I decided to be completely honest. "Well, yes. He's adjusting very well," I said. "So well, in fact, that he barely needs his mother anymore." Beatrice looked at me with understanding. "Oh honey, that happens with all children when they get married," she said. "You raise them thinking they'll be your companions forever. But the truth is you're raising them to leave." Her words struck me like a bolt of lightning. All these years, I had believed I was investing in a relationship that would grow stronger over time. But, in reality, I had been preparing Ethan to become completely independent of me. The problem wasn't that he had pulled away. The problem was that I hadn't prepared to live my own life when I was no longer needed as an active mother. That afternoon I decided to do something symbolic but important. I completely reorganized my house to suit my needs alone, not as a space always ready to welcome family visits. I packed away the extra dining chairs. I converted the guest room into my own sewing studio. I moved my favorite books to the main living area instead of keeping them hidden away in the bedroom. I changed the kitchen layout to make it more comfortable for one person. Every small change was a declaration of emotional independence. This house was no longer going to be a museum of motherhood, where everything was preserved for the convenience of a son who came around less and less. It was going to be the home of Grace Pirrell, a 67-year-old woman who had finally decided to live for herself. On Monday morning I started making more significant changes. I called the computer school at the community center and signed up for the basic course that started that week. I called my sister Maya in Charleston and told her I wanted to visit next month. I went to the bank and opened a separate savings account where I deposited half of my pension, money that would no longer be available for Ethan and Tasha's family emergencies. Each action was small in itself, but together they represented a silent revolution in how I lived. For 30 years I had been Ethan's mother. Now it was time to discover who Grace was when she wasn't defined solely by her maternal role. On Tuesday afternoon, while practicing on my new computer, which I had bought that very morning with money from my personal savings, I received a call from Tasha. "Mother Pirrell, how are you?" she asked. "I'm calling because my mom wants to invite you to lunch on Saturday. Nothing formal, just a ladies' lunch." It was the first time Tasha had called me directly in weeks, and I could detect something artificial in her overly friendly tone. "Will Ethan be there?" I asked. "No, it's just a ladies' lunch. My mom, my Aunt Rose, you and me." I paused for a moment. 3 weeks ago, I would have immediately accepted, grateful for any form of family inclusion. But now I had the perspective to recognize that this was probably an attempt to fulfill the social obligation of including the mother-in-law occasionally while maintaining control over when and how that inclusion happened. "Tasha, thank you very much for the invitation, but I already have plans for Saturday," I said, surprising myself with the ease of my refusal. "Oh well, don't worry. We'll do it another time," she replied. I could hear the surprise in her voice. She had clearly expected me to automatically accept any crumb of family attention that was offered. After we hung up, I realized I really did have plans for Saturday. My first advanced computer class and a visit to the San Juan market to buy materials for my personal embroidery projects. Plans I had made thinking only of my own enjoyment, without considering whether they interfered with Ethan and Tasha's needs or desires. On Wednesday, I received an unexpected call from my sister-in-law, Simone, the one who had been especially cold to me at the wedding. "Grace, how are you?" she asked. "I'm calling because my son Devin is having his first communion next month, and we wanted to invite you." Another invitation that had arrived weeks in advance, probably after much family debate about whether or not to include me. "Simone, thank you very much for thinking of me," I replied. "Can I confirm next week? I'm organizing my calendar and want to be sure I can attend properly." It was a diplomatic answer that gave me time to decide if I truly wanted to participate in family events where my presence was merely tolerated rather than desired. On Thursday night, as I ate a quiet dinner in my reorganized kitchen, I realized something fundamental. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel anxious waiting for phone calls. I wasn't watching the phone, hoping Ethan would need me for something. I wasn't mentally preparing excuses in case I had to cancel my own plans to attend to a family emergency. This new emotional independence hadn't arrived with dramatic pain, but with a gradual serenity that surprised me. It was as if I had been carrying an invisible weight for years, and had finally given myself permission to put it down. The love for Ethan remained intact, but it was no longer mixed with the constant anxiety of proving that I deserved his attention and respect. On Friday morning, as I ate breakfast and read a book I'd bought simply because I liked the cover, another luxury I hadn't allowed myself in years, the phone rang. It was Ethan, but this time his voice held a note of confusion. "Mom, Tasha told me you can't go to lunch on Saturday. Is everything okay? Are you feeling sick?"
"No, son. I'm perfectly fine," he replied.
"I just have other commitments." "What commitments?" he asked. I could detect the genuine surprise in his voice. Evidently, it hadn't occurred to him that I could have a social life independent of my availability for family events. "I'm taking computer classes and I have things to do around the house," I explained, keeping my tone casual. "Oh," was all he said, as if he were processing the idea that his mother had priorities that didn't revolve around him. After we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. For years, any family invitation had automatically been my top priority, regardless of what other plans I might have had. Ethan had grown up expecting that unconditional availability as a given. Now, encountering boundaries for the first time, he didn't know how to interpret the situation. That afternoon, as I organized my new embroidery materials in my personal studio, I received a text message from Tasha. "Mother Pearl, I hope you're not upset about something. If there's a problem, we can talk." It was interesting how my simple refusal to be immediately available had been interpreted as a sign of conflict. For years, my compliance had been so predictable that any different behavior was seen as problematic. I replied with a calm message. "I'm not upset, Tasha. I'm just organizing my time differently. Thank you very much for the invitation." It was a response that made it clear there was no drama, but also offered no lengthy explanations or apologies for having my own priorities. Saturday was the first day in years that I dedicated completely to my own interests. In the morning, I went to my computer class, where I met other women my age who were also learning technology after years of dedicating themselves exclusively to their families. In the afternoon, I went to the market and bought colored threads I had never used before. Special fabrics I had admired but never allowed myself to buy for personal projects. That night, as I ate dinner in my quiet kitchen, I realized I had spent an entire day without thinking about Ethan and Tasha, except occasionally. It was the first time in decades that my mind was occupied with my own projects, my own learning, my own satisfactions. The feeling was strange but deeply reassuring. On Sunday morning, as I watered the plants in my small garden, my neighbor Layla approached the fence separating our houses. "Say, honey, doesn't Ethan come around on Sundays anymore? I haven't seen him here in weeks." It was an innocent question, but it made me realize how my internal changes were starting to become visible to others. "Well, he's married now, right? Everyone has their own life," I replied, surprised by the casualness of my answer. 3 months ago, I would have launched into a detailed explanation of why Ethan wasn't visiting as often, probably justifying his absence and downplaying any hint of family problems. Layla nodded understandingly. "That's life, honey. The children grow up and you have to learn to live for yourself again. So how are you doing? How are you organizing things?" It was the first time anyone had specifically asked about my well-being apart from my family situation. "Very well," I said, and I realized it was completely true. "I'm learning new things, working on projects I had put off for years. I'm really enjoying having time for myself." Layla smiled. "I'm so glad to hear that. You seem very peaceful lately." That afternoon, as I worked on a complex embroidery piece I was doing simply because I loved the design, not because it was a gift for someone, I reflected on the profound changes that had occurred within me over the past 2 weeks. The initial pain of recognizing my new place in Ethan's life had transformed into something more constructive. The determination to build an identity that didn't depend on my role as a mother. For the first time in 30 years, Grace Pirrell was living for Grace Pirrell. And contrary to what I had feared, the world hadn't ended. Ethan and Tasha were doing perfectly fine without my constant attention. The house was still standing without being constantly prepared for unexpected family visits. My life had rhythm and purpose without being centered around the needs of others. It was as if I had been holding my breath for decades and had finally given myself permission to exhale completely. The air filling my lungs was different, cleaner, fresher, and completely mine. The real transformation began exactly 3 weeks after my conversation with Ethan. One Monday morning, I decided to do something I had never done in my 67 years. Write a list of everything I wanted to achieve, thinking only of my own happiness without considering how it would affect Ethan, Tasha, or anyone else in my family. I sat at my sewing table, now converted into a personal desk, with a new notebook I had bought specifically for this purpose, and started to write without censoring myself. I want to learn to use the computer well, so I can connect with people my age who have similar interests. I want to travel to Charleston to see Maya and stay as long as I want without asking if anyone needs me at home. I want to take advanced embroidery classes at the Community Art Center. I want to buy new clothes that I like, not just what is deemed appropriate for a woman my age. I want to go to the movies alone without feeling like I have to justify why I'm not accompanied. Every line I wrote was a small declaration of independence. For the first time in decades, I was formulating desires that had nothing to do with being useful to others, but with discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by my family roles. That same afternoon, I began to implement my list systematically and quietly. I called the Buckhead Art Center and enrolled in the artistic embroidery workshop that started on Thursday. I didn't mention this decision to anyone. I simply made it as any other independent adult would make a personal decision. I went to the mall and bought 3 brightly colored blouses that I loved the moment I saw them, without wondering if they were too youthful or if Ethan would approve of my choices. On Tuesday, I booked my bus ticket to Charleston for the following week, buying an open return ticket. When Maya asked me over the phone how long I planned to stay, I said something that surprised even me. I don't know exactly. It depends on how good I feel there. It was the first time in years that I had made plans without a predetermined deadline based on Ethan's potential needs. On Wednesday, I did something even more radical. I went to the bank and completely changed the distribution of my pension. Instead of keeping all the money available in my checking account for family emergencies, I divided my income into 4 categories: basic household expenses, personal savings, a true emergency fund, and a monthly budget for personal activities and pleasures. For the first time in my adult life, a significant portion of my money was earmarked exclusively for my personal enjoyment. These seemingly small changes represented a silent revolution in how I lived. For 30 years, I had operated as if my life were a shared resource where my decisions, my time, and my money were always subject to Ethan's needs. Now I was reclaiming my complete autonomy, not aggressively or dramatically, but with the quiet determination of someone who had finally understood her own worth. On Thursday, in my first embroidery class, I met a group of women who would change my perspective on what it meant to be an independent older woman. There was Layla, 72 years old, who had started painting professionally after being widowed at 65. Gloria, 69, who had learned to drive and now traveled alone all over the country. Alicia, 71, who had gone back to school and had just finished her GED. All of them had lived decades completely dedicated to their families, and were now discovering talents and passions they had never had time to explore. The secret, Layla told me as we practiced a new shading technique, is to stop asking for permission to live your own life. Our kids aren't children who need us to survive anymore, but we're still alive, and we have the right to do things that make us happy. Her words resonated deeply within me because they expressed exactly what I had been feeling, but hadn't known how to articulate so clearly. Gloria added, I spent 40 years waiting for my kids to invite me to their plans, for my husband to include me in his decisions, for my family to give me a place in their lives, until one day I realized I also have the right to make my own plans and invite whomever I want. Alicia completed the thought. The problem is that we teach our children that mom is always going to be available, always going to say yes, always going to put their needs before her own. And then we're surprised when they treat us exactly the way we taught them. That conversation was like hearing my own thoughts expressed by wiser, more experienced voices. I wasn't the only woman of my generation who had confused maternal love with complete self-negation. I wasn't the only one who had raised successful children at the cost of completely forgetting who she was herself. And more importantly, it wasn't too late to change this dynamic. On Friday, armed with this new perspective, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks ago. Ethan called to ask if I could watch Simone's kids on Saturday, because she and her husband wanted to go out, and had no one else to leave them with. It was exactly the kind of request I had automatically accepted for years, canceling any personal plans to be available for family needs. "Ethan," I said with a calmness that surprised me, "I won't be able to. I already have commitments for Saturday." "What commitments?" he asked with the same tone of genuine surprise he had used the previous week. "I'm going to the movies with some friends from my embroidery class, and afterward we're having dinner together." It was completely true. We had made these plans the day before. "But Mom, Simone really needs someone to watch the children. She doesn't know anyone else she trusts." His response revealed something fundamental. For years, I had been the automatic solution for any childcare problem in the family. Not because I was the best option, but because I was the only one who never said no. "I'm sure they'll find another solution," I replied. "There are plenty of responsible babysitters. Or they can ask one of Simone's friends." Ethan was silent for a moment, clearly processing that his mother wasn't offering alternatives or committing to solving Simone's problem. "Is everything okay, Mom? Lately, I've noticed you're very different." It was the first time Ethan had verbalized that he had noticed changes in my behavior. "I'm doing very well, son. I'm just learning to organize my time differently, by including things that I like, not just the things the family needs." After we hung up, I realized I had crossed an invisible but crucial line. For the first time, I had put my own plans ahead of a non-urgent family need. Ethan would have to explain to Simone that his mother was no longer automatically available as an emergency babysitter. Simone would have to find solutions that didn't depend on my unconditional availability. It was a small but revolutionary change. On Saturday, I had an experience I hadn't had in decades. An entire day of adult fun with women my age who shared my interests. We went to see a Mexican film about an older woman who decided to change her life after being widowed. Afterward, we had dinner at a restaurant where none of us had to cook, serve, or clean. We talked about our personal projects, the books we were reading, and the trips we wanted to take. It was like rediscovering a part of myself that had been dormant for so long that I had almost forgotten it existed. Grace, the woman, not just Grace, the mother of Ethan. Throughout the night, I didn't receive a single phone call asking where I was, or when I would be back. Ethan and Tasha had sorted out their weekend without needing to include or consult me, exactly as it should be between independent adults. On Sunday morning, as I ate a quiet breakfast and read a book Gloria had lent me about women who had reinvented their lives after 60, the phone rang. It was Tasha, and her voice had a note of thinly veiled irritation. "Mother Pyral, Simone told us you couldn't watch the children yesterday. I hope it wasn't because of some discomfort." "No, Tasha, it wasn't because of any discomfort. I simply had other plans," I replied, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Oh well, Simone was left with no options and had to cancel her outing with her husband. We thought maybe it was a misunderstanding." It was fascinating to observe how my simple refusal was being interpreted as a problem requiring explanation or correction. There was no misunderstanding, I assured her. "I also have a social life and personal plans." Simone had ample time to arrange for a sitter if she truly needed to go out. Tasha went silent for a moment, clearly not expecting me to defend my decision so directly. "Well, I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," she finally stated. "Everything is perfectly fine, Tasha. Thank you for asking." After hanging up, it dawned on me that I had established an important precedent. My personal decisions did not require extensive justifications or apologies to the family. That afternoon, while packing for my trip to Charleston, Scheduled to begin the following day, I pondered the profound changes that had taken place within me over those 3 weeks. There hadn't been any dramatic confrontations or tearful discussions about my hurt feelings. I had simply begun to act like the independent person I had always had the right to be, but had somehow forgotten how to be. Early on Monday, as I waited for the bus at the station, I received a text message from Ethan. "Mom, Tasha told me you're going on a trip. Why didn't you let us know sooner? When are you coming back?" It was interesting how a week-long personal trip was being treated, as though it were a decision that required prior family approval. I replied from the bus, "Son, I'm a 67-year-old adult. I don't need to ask permission to visit my sister. I'll be back when my visit is over. Love you both." It was a message that established clear yet loving boundaries. I could love my family without feeling obligated to report every movement of my personal life. During the 4-hour trip to Charleston, I dedicated myself to watching the passing scenery and reflecting on the woman I had been 3 weeks prior, compared to the woman I was now. The most significant difference wasn't that I had stopped loving Ethan, but that I had stopped using his approval as the sole measure of my self-worth. His happiness was still important to me, but it was no longer more important than my own happiness. Maya greeted me at her Charleston home with a genuine joy I hadn't experienced in years. "Sister, I'm so glad you finally decided to come. You look different, more relaxed or something." Her observation confirmed that the internal changes were being reflected externally in ways I hadn't fully recognized myself. During my first night in Charleston, while enjoying dinner on her porch and reminiscing about our deceased siblings, our memories of youth, and our plans for the years we had left to live, I came to a fundamental realization. It had been years since I had engaged in a conversation where Ethan or his needs weren't mentioned. For the first time in decades, I was simply Grace, talking with her sister about topics that interested both of us as independent adult women. "You know what?" Maya said after I told her about my embroidery classes and new friends. "I always thought you were too dedicated to Ethan. It's not wrong to be a good mother, but you completely forgot to be Grace." Her words were direct but spoken with kindness, as only a sister can deliver uncomfortable truths. "You're right," I admitted. "But it's never too late to remember who you are, is it?" Maya smiled. "Not at all. In fact, I think your 60s and 70s can be a woman's best years if she finally gives herself permission to live for herself." That night, in the guest room of Maya's house, I went to bed with a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I wasn't worried about whether Ethan needed me for something, whether I had left everything organized at home, or whether my absence was causing family inconvenience. I was simply enjoying being in a new place with my dear sister, living an experience I had chosen solely because it made me happy. The next 5 days in Charleston were a continuous revelation. Maya took me to see the sweetgrass basket workshops where artists our age had started their careers after 60. We visited colonial churches where I stopped to admire antique needlework without rushing, and without having to watch the clock. We went to the artisan market where I bought materials for personal projects without wondering if the expense was justifiable. But the most important thing was that during those days, I rediscovered aspects of my personality that had been dormant for decades. It turned out I had very defined opinions about art, that I liked to debate American history, that I thoroughly enjoyed walking down unfamiliar streets without a specific destination. It was like reconnecting with a version of myself that had existed before my entire identity was defined in terms of my maternal role. On Wednesday of my stay in Charleston, I received a call from Ethan that revealed the extent to which my changes were affecting the established family dynamic. "Mom, when exactly are you coming back? Tasha wants to organize a family dinner for the weekend, and we need to know if you'll be available." "Ethan," I said while admiring the harbor from Maya's porch, "I don't know exactly when I'll be back. I'm very comfortable here with my sister." "What do you mean you don't know? Didn't you buy a return ticket?" "I bought an open ticket so I could come back whenever I feel like it." The silence on the other end of the line indicated that Ethan was processing something completely new. A mother who didn't have fixed plans based on family needs, but was living spontaneously according to her own desires. But Mom, Tasha already started planning the dinner. She's inviting her parents and she wanted you to be there. It was fascinating how the dinner was being presented as a favor they were doing for me, when in reality they needed my presence to complete their image of a harmonious family. Tell Tasha to organize her dinner without counting on me, I replied with a calmness that surprised even me. If I'm back by that day and don't have other plans, I'll gladly join you. But she shouldn't base her plans on my availability because I don't have a fixed return date. After hanging up, Maya looked at me with a proud smile. That's my sister. It was about time you taught them that you have a life of your own too. Her words confirmed that I was on the right path toward healthy emotional independence. On Friday, I decided to extend my visit by one more week, not because I had specific plans, but because I simply didn't feel like going back yet. I called Ethan to inform him of my decision. Son, I'm going to stay in Charleston for another week. Maya's going to take me to see Savannah and some towns in the region. Another week, Mom? You've already been there almost a week. His tone revealed a mix of surprise and something that sounded like impatience. Yes, and I'm going to stay another week because I'm really enjoying this experience. My house will still be there when I get back, Ethan. And so will my things. It was the first time in my adult life that I was making decisions based solely on what I felt like doing, without considering how it would affect others, or if it was what was expected of me. The feeling was terrifying and liberating at the same time, like learning to walk again after years of relying on emotional crutches. That night, while Maya and I planned our excursion to Savannah, I received a message from Tasha that revealed the true extent of my transformation. Mother Parcel, we understand you want to enjoy your trip, but Ethan is worried because you've never been away from home for so long. We just want to make sure you're okay. I replied, Tasha, I'm perfectly fine. I'm on vacation with my sister, something I should have done years ago. Ethan doesn't need to worry about an adult woman who is visiting her family in another state. It was a message that clearly established that my well-being did not require constant family supervision. At the end of my second week in Charleston, as I packed to return home because I had decided it was time to go back, not because anyone had asked me to, I reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred during this time. It hadn't been a dramatic revolution with emotional confrontations, but a silent evolution toward complete emotional independence. During the trip back to Atlanta, I observed my reflection in the bus window, and saw a different woman from the one who had left 2 weeks earlier. She was the same Grace physically, but there was something in her eyes that was new. A serenity that came from having rediscovered her own worth independent of her function as a mother. When I arrived at my Southside house that afternoon, I found several messages on my answering machine from Ethan asking what time I would arrive, if I needed to be picked up at the station, and if everything was okay. But for the first time, I didn't feel the urgency to call immediately to reassure everyone about my well-being. First, I took a relaxing bath, unpacked calmly, and prepared a light dinner for myself. Only then, when I was ready and comfortable, did I call Ethan. Son, I'm home. Everything went great. I'll tell you about the trip tomorrow. Mom, we were worried. Why didn't you call as soon as you arrived? Ethan, I'm a responsible adult. I don't need to report every movement of my life. See you soon. That night, in my house reorganized for my personal comfort, I went to bed with the deep satisfaction of someone who had achieved something very difficult, transforming a toxic family dynamic without the need for dramatic confrontations or explosive breakups. I had reclaimed my emotional autonomy simply by exercising it day by day, decision by decision. The most significant change wasn't in how Ethan and Tasha treated me, though that had also improved substantially. The most important change was in how I saw myself. I no longer needed their approval to validate my existence. I no longer measured my worth by my utility to them. I no longer lived waiting for them to include me in their lives. Now I had my own rich and satisfying life in which they could participate if they wanted, and if they respected me appropriately. 2 months after that transformative conversation, while working on a complex embroidery piece in my personal studio, the phone rang. It was Ethan. Mom, do you have plans for Sunday? Tasha and I want to do something special with you. What kind of something special? I asked, genuinely curious. We want to take you to visit an artist's studio that was recommended to us. We thought you'd like to see how he works because he specializes in traditional African American textile work. It was an invitation based on my personal interests, not their family needs. I love the idea, I said. What time will you pick me up? Does 10 o'clock in the morning sound good? Perfect. I'll be waiting for you there. It was a simple but revolutionary conversation, an invitation that included me because they specifically wanted my company, not because they needed something from me. That Sunday, as we walked through the textile artist's studio and I explained techniques I recognized from my years of sewing experience, I saw something in Ethan and Tasha's eyes that had been absent for years. Genuine respect for my knowledge and experience. I was no longer just the mom with stories from the past. I was Grace, a woman with valuable expertise and a unique perspective. The artist, a man in his 50s named Arturo, asked me technical questions about traditional embroidery that I was able to answer with detail and precision. Ethan and Tasha observed me with something that looked like surprise, as if they were rediscovering aspects of my personality they had taken for granted or ignored for years. I didn't know you knew so much about textile history, Tasha said as we drove home. It never occurred to me to ask, Ethan added. It's impressive how you can identify the techniques and regions of origin just by looking at the patterns. Their comments made me reflect on how much knowledge and experience I had kept silent for years. Not because I didn't want to share it, but because there had never been space in our family conversations for me to be the expert, the one who had something interesting to teach. That afternoon, after they dropped me off at home, I sat in my favorite rocking chair and mentally reviewed the path I had traveled since that wedding night when I overheard Tasha celebrating my absence. The woman who had been hurt by those comments no longer existed. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had built a rich and independent life, and who had taught her family to respect her, not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine recognition of who she was as a person. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was my friend Gloria from the embroidery workshop. Grace, what are your plans for tomorrow? Oilia wants us to go with her to see an exhibition of folk art at the Fulton County Arts Center. I love the idea, I replied immediately. What time should we meet? As I talked with Gloria about our plans, I realized something that filled me with deep satisfaction. I had an active social life that didn't depend on Ethan and Tasha. I had personal projects that excited me. I had friends who valued my company regardless of what I could do for them. I was no longer a woman who existed on the margins of her son's life. I was a woman with a life of her own who generously included her family when the respect was mutual. The final lesson wasn't that I had stopped loving Ethan or cut my family ties. The lesson was that I had learned to love myself with the same intensity with which I had loved others for decades. And that self-love had transformed all my relationships, not just the family one, making them more authentic, more balanced, and paradoxically more loving. That night, as I prepared my clothes for the next day, which included a cultural outing with my friends and a dinner Ethan and Tasha had invited me to a week in advance, I smiled, thinking about the woman I had been and the woman I was now. Both had loved deeply, but only one had learned that true love begins with oneself and extends toward others, from a place of fullness, not from an emptiness that needs to be filled by external approval. 6 months had passed since that transformative conversation with Ethan and Tasha, and as I watered my geraniums in the small garden, I had completely redesigned to my own taste. I reflected on the serene woman I had become. It was a perfect October morning in Southside Atlanta, with that golden light that makes everything seem possible. And for the first time in decades, I felt completely at peace with the direction my life had taken. My morning routine had evolved into something I never would have imagined at 67. I got up at 6:30, not because I had to make breakfast for someone else or be ready in case they needed me early, but because I had discovered that the first hours of the day were my most creative and peaceful time. I made coffee in my new coffee maker, another personal whim I had indulged in, sat on the porch I had decorated with plants and a comfortable rocker, and spent a full hour simply existing without a specific agenda. During those silent moments, I watched how the light changed on the leaves of my plants. I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood gradually waking up, and allowed my thoughts to flow without a particular direction. It was a luxury I hadn't given myself in 30 years. The luxury of not mentally organizing the day's tasks based on the needs of others, but simply breathing and being present in my own life. After coffee, I went to my sewing studio, which I had converted into a truly personal space. The walls were decorated with my favorite embroidery pieces, not because they were gifts for someone, but because I like seeing my work well displayed. The large table I had bought allowed me to spread out complex projects without having to constantly put everything away to make space for other family activities. It was my space, organized according to my comfort and my creative needs. That morning I was working on a large format tapestry that I had designed myself, inspired by traditional African motifs, but with my personal interpretation of the colors and shapes. It was a project that would take me months to complete, but that was precisely its beauty. It was something I was doing solely for my own enjoyment, with no deadline, no external pressure, and no need to justify the time or materials invested. As I embroidered, my mind frequently returned to the transformation I had undergone, not just in my relationship with Ethan and Tasha, but in my relationship with myself. The woman who had heard those cruel comments at the wedding no longer existed. In her place was a woman who knew her intrinsic worth, who had learned to set boundaries without guilt, and who had discovered talents and passions that had been dormant for decades. The deepest change wasn't visible from the outside, but lay in the internal silence I had managed to cultivate. For years, my mind had been a constant murmur of worries about Ethan. Had he eaten well? Would he need something? Was he upset with me about something? What could I do to make sure he kept needing me? Now that murmur had been replaced by a deep serenity that allowed me to think of him with love but without anxiety, to care about his well-being without feeling I had to solve all his problems. At 10 o'clock in the morning, as I had done for the last 3 months, I prepared for my daily walk through the trails of the Southside Greenway Park. It was an activity I had started on a doctor's recommendation to maintain my physical health, but which had become one of my favorite times of the day. During those 40 minutes of walking, I contemplated nature, greeted other neighbors who were also exercising, and simply enjoyed the movement of my body in the space. On one of the park benches, I met Beatrice, a 73-year-old woman who had recently been widowed and was going through the process I had experienced months earlier, rediscovering who she was when she wasn't defined solely by her traditional family roles. "Good morning, Grace." She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How are you?" "Very well, Beatrice. And how are things going at your house?" I knew her children had been pressuring her to move to a smaller apartment and sell the house where she had lived for 40 years. "Well, we're managing," she sighed. "My children insist that the house is too big for me alone, that it's too much work to maintain, but that house holds all my history. You know, I don't know if I'm ready to leave it." Her words vividly reminded me of my own internal struggles when I was learning to differentiate between what I really wanted and what others thought I should want. "Beatrice," I said, sitting beside her on the bench, "what do you want to do? Not what your children think is best, not what is most practical according to others, but what you truly desire in your heart." She looked at me with surprise, as if it were the first time someone had specifically asked about her own desires. "Well, I'd like to stay in my house," she admitted timidly. "I like my garden. I know all my neighbors. I have my routine set up, but my children say I'm stubborn, that I won't accept that things have to change." It was the same dynamic I had experienced. Adult children who confuse genuine care with control over their mother's decisions. "And can you maintain the house financially? Do you feel safe living alone?" I asked her, addressing the real practical questions instead of the emotional ones. "Yes to both things," she replied immediately. "I have my pension, the house is paid off, and I feel perfectly safe. It's just that my children think a woman my age shouldn't live alone in a big house." I smiled at her with understanding. "Beatrice, you are a competent adult who has the right to make your own decisions as long as you are able to do so. If you want to stay in your house and can do so, that is your decision, not your children's." She saw something in my eyes that reassured her. Do you really think it's okay for me to tell my children no when they insist I move? I think it's okay for you to live your life according to your own wishes and needs, I replied. Children sometimes forget that their mothers are still independent people with the right to make decisions, even when those decisions aren't the ones they would make. We talked for 20 more minutes, and when we said goodbye, Beatrice had a more determined expression, as if she had recalled something important about her own worth and autonomy. That conversation made me reflect on how many women of my generation were struggling with similar family dynamics, and how my own transformation had turned me into a kind of involuntary role model for others who were seeking their path toward late emotional independence. Upon returning home, I found a message on my answering machine from my sister Maya in Charleston. Grace, just calling to say hello, and tell you that my neighbor Rosario is going through something very similar to what you experienced with Ethan. I told her your story and she wants to know if she can call you to talk. She said she needs to hear from someone who managed to change that dynamic without losing the family. It was interesting how my personal experience had become a source of inspiration for other women in similar situations. Over the last few months, I had received several calls from Maya's friends, acquaintances from my embroidery class, and even neighbors who had heard about my transformation and wanted advice on how to set healthy boundaries with adult children. I called Maya back immediately. Sister, of course Rosario can call me. You know, I'd be happy to help other women who are going through this. Oh, Grace, Maya said affectionately. You don't know what an impressive change you've made. I listen to you and you sound like a different person, more self-assured, more peaceful. It's as if you found your place in the world. Her words moved me because they captured exactly what I felt. I had found my place in the world, not as an appendage to Ethan's life, but as Grace Parsol, a complete woman with her own interests, talents, relationships, and projects. That afternoon I had my weekly advanced embroidery class at the Art Center, where I had progressed so much that the teacher, Carmen, curiously the same name as my daughter-in-law, but a completely different personality, she'd asked me to help instruct some of the new folks in the basics. It was the first time in ages that anyone had seen me as someone with expertise, someone whose knowledge was valuable and worth passing along. During the class I was paired with Norma, a woman of about 45 who had taken up embroidery as therapy following a tough divorce. Grace, she said as I was showing her how to execute a particularly intricate stitch, you have such incredible patience when you're teaching. It's obvious you really enjoy sharing what you know. Her words truly resonated with me because they confirmed something I had begun to realize about myself. I seemed to have a natural knack for teaching and found immense satisfaction in helping others cultivate their abilities. The teacher, Carmen, came over while I was demonstrating the technique. Grace, she said, I've been mulling something over. Would you be interested in teaching a Saturday morning workshop for ladies who are keen to learn traditional American folk embroidery? We've had a ton of requests, but we need someone with your experience and, more importantly, your patience. This proposal really excited me. The idea of turning my passion into a formal activity that would not only benefit others but also give me a real sense of professional purpose at 67 was amazing. I'd love that, I replied immediately. When could we possibly get started? In 2 weeks, if that works for you. It would be a 6-session workshop, and of course we would pay you for your time. It was truly the first time in my life that someone had offered me money to do something that I genuinely loved. Not out of any kind of economic necessity, but as a genuine recognition of the value of the skills I possessed. That night, while I was having a quiet dinner in my newly reorganized kitchen and contemplating the teaching proposal, the phone suddenly rang. It was Ethan. Mom. How are you doing? Am I catching you at a bad time? The way he asked had noticeably changed over the past few months. He now seemed to acknowledge that I might actually have activities or commitments that didn't revolve solely around his availability. You're not interrupting, son. I just finished my dinner. How are you and Tasha doing? We're doing great, Mom. Actually, that's the reason I was calling. Tasha wants to invite you to a special dinner this Friday. It's our 6-month wedding anniversary, and we would really love to celebrate it with you. It was precisely the kind of invitation I had grown accustomed to receiving, planned well in advance, based on including my presence as something actively desired, rather than just automatically assumed. That's so lovely, son. I'm really happy that you want to celebrate it with me. What time are you thinking? Does 7 o'clock sound good? We were thinking of trying out a new restaurant that we think you'll really like. It specializes in modern Southern cuisine. The restaurant choice suggested that they had actually taken my preferences into consideration when making the plans, and not simply their own. Perfect. I'll be there, I confirmed. Mom, Ethan added, with a note of real affection evident in his voice. Tasha and I were just talking about how proud we both are to see everything you're accomplishing. Your classes, your creative projects, and your new friends. You seem so genuinely happy lately. His words really touched me because they showed a level of observation and appreciation that I hadn't experienced before. Thank you so much, son. I am very happy. I've truly discovered aspects of myself that I never even knew existed. And it really shows, he said. Tasha always comments on how much more interesting it is to talk to you now that we actually talk about your projects and not just about us. It was such a perceptive observation that totally confirmed how the dynamics of our conversations had fundamentally shifted. After hanging up the phone, I sat down in my reorganized living room and allowed a profound sense of gratitude to simply wash over me for the incredible journey I had been on. The woman who had felt so hurt by Tasha's comments at the wedding had actually used that pain as a catalyst for a major transformation that had enriched not only her own life, but also, importantly, her family relationships. The anniversary dinner on Friday night was a real revelation of just how much our family dynamics had changed. For the first time in what felt like years, I spent an entire evening with Ethan and Tasha where I truly felt seen, heard, and genuinely valued as an independent person. We talked about the new embroidery workshop I was going to teach, the books I was currently reading, and my plans to travel to Charleston again, and perhaps even explore some other cities in the South. Tasha specifically asked me about the different embroidery techniques I was learning, showing a genuine technical interest, rather than just offering social courtesy. Ethan even asked me for my advice on how to decorate a wall in their condo, actually valuing my aesthetic judgment after years of essentially dismissing it as old-fashioned. It was almost as if they had finally realized that they had a mother who had her own distinct personality, valuable knowledge, and legitimately interesting perspectives. During dessert, Tasha made a comment that genuinely surprised me with its depth. Mother Parcel, she said. I've been doing a lot of reflecting on my relationship with my own mom lately, and I've realized that I was starting to make the exact same mistakes with her that we used to make with you. Taking her for granted, not really considering her personal interests, and just assuming that she would always simply be available for whatever we needed. It was a powerful observation that showed how my transformation had created ripples of awareness that extended beyond just our immediate relationship. Ethan added, I've been thinking about that a lot too. It's way too easy to see our mothers only as mothers, and not as complete women with their own lives and their own things going on. I really think that's a mistake that a lot of children make. His words indicated a level of self-awareness that truly filled me with hope for the future of all of our family relationships. At the end of the night, when Ethan walked me out to my car, he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked me specifically about my emotional well-being, and not just about my physical health. Mom, are you truly happy with the changes you've made in your life? It was a question that showed a genuine interest in my inner state, not just in my functionality as a readily available mother. Very happy, son, I replied with complete and total honesty. For the first time in many years, I really feel like I'm living my own life, and not just simply existing based solely on the needs of others. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I'm so incredibly glad to hear you say that, and I'm also genuinely ashamed that it took me so long to realize that you also deserve to have your own life. His words were like a soothing balm for old wounds that had already healed, but that I still definitely remembered. Ethan, I said, taking his hand, the important thing really isn't how long it took us to learn, but that we finally actually did. Now we finally have the opportunity to build a much better relationship based on mutual respect and genuine love. and not simply on dependence or guilt. That night after Ethan left, I sat out on my porch under the stars and reflected on my entire journey. From the initial pain of feeling invisible and undervalued to the conscious decision to finally reclaim my autonomy, to building a completely new independent identity, and then finally to creating much more authentic and balanced family relationships. The quiet that had settled in my life wasn't an empty or resentful quiet, but a quiet that was actually full of real peace and real purpose. It was the quiet of someone who had finally learned to truly value herself independently of needing any kind of external approval, who had built a life that was rich in personal meaning, and who had transformed both pain into wisdom and invisibilization into real empowerment. As I looked up at the stars from my small Southside garden, I thought about all of the other women out there like Beatrice, like Rosario and Charleston, like all of the students in my future embroidery workshop, who were all at some point on their own personal journey toward emotional independence. My own experience had become something that was so much bigger than just my own personal story. It had become a living example that it is truly never too late to rediscover who you really are when you finally stop defining yourself solely by what you can do for other people. The final reflection of that truly perfect night was a very deep understanding that filled me with so much serenity. I had finally learned that true love, including family love, flourishes best when it is actually based on mutual respect and individual autonomy, and not simply on dependence or constant sacrifice. Ethan and Tasha now loved me so much more authentically because they actually respected me as an independent person. And I loved them so much more freely now that I didn't really need their approval in order to validate my own existence. Sometimes the greatest gift that we can possibly give to those that we love is simply to teach them how to love us as we truly deserve to be loved, as complete, valuable, and fully independent people. And sometimes the greatest act of self-love that we can do is to give ourselves permission to be exactly who we truly are without any apologies, without any justifications, and without that constant need to prove our own worth through constant service to others. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.